1:15 in the morning, the North Arabian Sea. USS Gerald R. Ford was carving a wide, white wake through the black water as the 97,000-ton carrier turned hard into the wind. This was not a routine night patrol or a training exercise. For the crew of Carrier Air Wing 8, for the last 4 hours, ordnance men in the magazines below had been working in high-speed shifts to move live ammunition to the flight deck. In less than 60 minutes, the pride of the Iranian submarine fleet, sitting at the piers of Bandar Abbas, would face a threat they never saw coming. The air on the flight deck was thick with the heavy, chemical smell of JP-5 jet fuel and the sharp, iron spray of the salt sea. High above, the moon was a sliver of bone against a sky that felt heavy and cold. Under the glare of the deck floodlights, hundreds of sailors, in colored jerseys, moved with the precision of a clockwork machine. Yellow shirts directed the movement of the massive aircraft, their wands cutting bright neon lines through the dark. Purple shirts managed the fuel lines, and red shirts made the final checks on the weapons pylons. To the casual observer, it was chaos. To the United States Navy, it was a perfectly choreographed prelude to a strike. The first aircraft to move toward the electromagnetic aircraft launch system were the EA-18 Gulf Growlers. These electronic warfare jets were the primary shield for the strike package. Their mission was simple but critical: to find and blind every Iranian radar station from the coast to the inner harbor. Each Growler carried a full load of AGM-88 HARM missiles and high-capacity jamming pods. Without their success, the rest of the Alpha strike would be flying into a wall of surface-to-air missiles. Behind the Growlers sat the F-35 Bravo stealth fighters. Their dark, radar-absorbent skins seemed to swallow the deck lights, making them look like jagged shadows against the gray steel of the ship. They would be the first into the airspace, flying ahead of the main force to identify mobile missile batteries and clear a path for the heavy hitters. Captain James Miller, the commanding officer of the carrier, stood on the bridge, watching the activity through high-powered binoculars. He could feel the low-frequency vibration of the 4 propulsion shafts, pushing the massive ship to 30 knots. The Gerald R. Ford was a city of steel, and right now, every citizen of that city was focused on a single objective. The intelligence reports from the previous hour were clear. 3 Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines and 4 of the newer Fateh-class boats were clustered at the main pier for a scheduled refueling. It was a target of opportunity that would not last until dawn. The first Growler moved on to Catapult 1. The jet engines began to roar, a sound that started as a low rumble and grew into a physical force that vibrated in the chests of everyone on deck. The pilot gave a crisp salute. The deck officer, crouched low against the wind, swept his arm forward. There was no puff of steam like on the older carriers. Instead, there was only a high-pitched hum of electromagnetic energy. The EA-18 Gulf Growlers shot forward, accelerating from 0 to 160 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The aircraft cleared the bow, dipped for a fraction of a second, and then climbed steeply into the night sky. Its afterburners, 2 points of orange fire against the stars. One by one, the electronic warfare package launched. Then came the F-35 Bravo fighters. The deck was a continuous cycle of noise and motion. As soon as one aircraft left the wire, another was being taxied into position. The coordination required to launch 30 aircraft in such a short window was the result of thousands of hours of practice. The main strike force consisted of FA-18 Super Hornets, each one loaded with 2 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions. These were the hammers. Their targets were the reinforced submarine pens and the submarines themselves. If the mission was successful, the Iranian Navy would lose its ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz for a generation. As the last Super Hornet disappeared into the darkness, a sudden silence fell over the flight deck. The roar of the engines faded, replaced by the sound of the wind and the crashing of the waves against the hull. The sailors on deck did not cheer. They immediately began preparing the deck for the recovery of the aircraft, knowing that the real work was just beginning hundreds of miles to the north. On the radar screens in the Combat Direction Center, 30 blue icons were moving in a tight formation toward the Iranian coast. They were flying low, hugging the surface of the water to stay below the horizon. The electronic shield was being raised. The Alpha strike was underway, and the clock was ticking toward the first impact. 1:45 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman, 60 miles southeast of the Iranian coastline. The 4 EA-18 Gulf Growlers of Electronic Attack Squadron 135 were the first to cross the invisible threshold of the enemy's early warning radar. Flying at a sustained speed of 450 knots, the jets maintained a low-altitude profile of only 500 feet above the white-capped waves. Inside the cramped cockpits, the electronic warfare officers were not looking through the canopy at the moonlit water. Their world was defined by the glowing green and amber symbols on their multi-function displays, tracking the invisible pulses of energy radiating from the Iranian mainland. The air inside the cockpits was pressurized and cool, smelling faintly of bottled oxygen and the ozone of high-powered electronics. Beneath the pilots, the ANALQ-99 jamming pods hummed with a low-frequency vibration that could be felt through the floorboards. These pods were currently in a passive state, listening to the electronic environment, waiting for the first sign that the Iranian air defense network had woken up. At latitude 25 degrees, 40 minutes north, and longitude 57 degrees, 12 minutes east, the electronic environment suddenly shifted. On the radar screens, a series of jagged spikes appeared. The Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries at Jask had just energized their long-range search radars. Contact. Echo 1. Jask. The lead electronic warfare officer called out over the encrypted Link 16 data network. The voice was calm, a hallmark of the intensive training every United States Navy aviator undergoes. Engaging soft kill now. With a flick of a switch, the Growlers initiated a high-powered noise jamming sequence. The pods beneath the wings erupted with massive amounts of electromagnetic energy, directed with surgical precision at the coordinates of the Iranian radar sites. On the Iranian screens, the clear picture of the Gulf was instantly replaced by a wall of white static. The electronic shield had been raised. Behind the Growlers, the 4 F-35 Bravo fighters of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 211 utilized their stealthy profiles to slip through the newly created gaps in the radar coverage. While the Growlers were the loud, blunt instrument of the electronic shield, the F-35 Bravo was the scalpel. Using their advanced AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radars in a low probability of intercept mode, the stealth fighters began to map the Iranian coastline with terrifying clarity. The mission of the F-35 Bravo was to identify the specific mobile radar units that the jamming might have missed. As they approached the shore, the synthetic aperture radar on, the stealth jets produced high-resolution imagery of the coastal defenses. They saw everything: the repositioning of truck-mounted missile launchers, the rotation of the radar dishes, and even the movement of personnel near the battery command vehicles. Suddenly, a new threat appeared on the displays. A mobile radar unit, hidden in the rugged foothills of the Makran Mountains, began to emit a high-frequency tracking signal. It was an attempt to burn through the Growlers' jamming. Magnum, the lead F-35 Bravo pilot transmitted. Under the wing of the stealth fighter, an AGM-88 HARM missile detached from its pylon. The rocket motor ignited with a brilliant white flash, punching the missile forward into the dark sky at 3 times the speed of sound. The missile did not need a pilot to guide it. It simply put its nose on the source of the radar emission and dove toward the Earth. The Iranian radar operators never had time to shut down their equipment. The 200-pound high-explosive warhead of the AGM-88 HARM missile detonated exactly 4 meters above the radar van. The blast wave shattered the sensitive electronics and sent a rain of white-hot shrapnel through the surrounding support vehicles. The tracking signal vanished from the American displays instantly. For the next 20 minutes, The electronic shield held firm. The Growlers moved in a racetrack pattern, flooding the airwaves with a complex symphony of digital noise that rendered the Iranian air defense network blind and deaf. One by one, the coastal radar sites that attempted to lock onto the incoming strike force were suppressed, either by electronic jamming or by the swift arrival of a HARM missile. The results were decisive. The United States forces had successfully neutralized 12 separate radar installations and silenced 3 surface-to-air missile batteries without losing a single aircraft. The electronic corridor was open, stretching from the open sea directly to the piers of Bandar Abbas. As the Growlers maintained their orbit, the main strike force of 20 FA-18 Super Hornets surged through the gap. They were now less than 100 miles from their target. The Iranian submarine fleet was still sitting at the piers, unaware that the electronic eyes meant to protect them had already been extinguished. 2:15 in the morning. The rugged coastline of southern Iran, 40 miles south of Bandar Abbas, 20 FA-18 Super Hornets and 4 F-35 Bravo fighters crossed the beach at an altitude of only 300 feet, above the crashing surf. They were moving at 520 knots, their engines dialed back to a low observable power setting, to minimize their infrared signature. The transition from the flat, dark expanse of the North Arabian Sea to the jagged, vertical terrain of the Iranian mainland was instantaneous. The pilots adjusted their flight controls, the fly-by-wire systems of the aircraft reacting in milliseconds to the turbulent air rolling off the coastal cliffs. Inside the cockpits, the green glow of the heads-up displays reflected off the visors of the pilots' helmets. Every aviator in Carrier Air Wing 8 was now operating under strict emission control. Their radars were silent. Their radios were slaved to receiving only, and their navigation was handled by internal inertial systems backed by the Global Positioning System. To the world outside, the 24 aircraft were ghosts, silent shapes cutting through the humid night air. The environment inside the cockpit was a stark contrast to the violent speed of the mission. The only sounds were the steady hiss of the oxygen system and the low, rhythmic hum of the twin General Electric 4-4 engines. The air smelled of dry, recycled cabin air and the faint, metallic scent of the pilot's own sweat. Through the night vision goggles, the world was a monochromatic landscape of neon green. The mountains of the Makran Range rose up ahead like jagged teeth, some peaks reaching 3,000 feet. Fence in, the strike lead signaled via a single, pre-coded data burst over the Link 16 network. Every pilot reached out and flipped the master arm switch to the on position. On the multi-function displays, the weapon icons turned from white to a steady, lethal red. Underneath the wings of the Super Hornets, the 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munitions were now receiving constant targeting updates from the aircraft mission computers. The thermal batteries in the tail kits of the bombs were energized, and the internal guidance fins performed a quick self-test. The strike package was now weaving through the valley floors using a technique known as terrain masking. By keeping the massive ridges of the mountains between themselves and the known Iranian radar sites at Bandar Abbas, the American pilots ensured that even if the electronic jamming failed, the physical Earth would hide their approach. The aircraft banked hard left and then right, following the contours of the dry riverbeds that carved through the desert floor. The G-forces pushed the pilots into their seats, their flight suits inflating against their legs to keep the blood in their upper bodies. At coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 56 degrees 15 minutes east, the formation reached the final navigation waypoint before the target run. To the north, the faint, flickering lights of Bandar Abbas began to appear on the horizon. The city was unaware of the 24 predators currently screaming toward its harbor at nearly 10 miles per minute, high above the strike package, orbiting at 30,000 feet and 60 miles out at sea. An E-2 Charlie Hawkeye command and control aircraft monitored the entire battle space, Its massive rotating dome was silent, but its passive sensors were drinking in every electronic emission in the region. The crew on the Hawkeye watched as the blue icons of the strike force moved toward the red icons representing the Iranian submarine piers. There were no Iranian interceptors in the air. The distraction provided by the initial seed strike had worked perfectly. The tactical plan was now entering its most dangerous phase. To achieve the precision required to destroy the submarines without hitting civilian infrastructure in the nearby city, the pilots would have to pop up from their low-level flight just 10 miles from the target. This would expose them to the short-range point defense systems surrounding the naval base, including Russian-made Pantsir S-1 missile systems and heavy anti-aircraft guns. The lead pilot of Strike Fighter Squadron 3-1 adjusted his grip on the control stick. He could see the target area on his infrared display. The Kilo-class submarines looked like long, dark shadows against the lighter gray of the concrete piers. They were tied up in a neat row, exactly as the intelligence brief had predicted. The heat from their auxiliary generators showed up as bright, white hotspots on his screen. The air was still. The mountains fell away as the strike force reached the coastal plain. Ahead lay the target, and the time for stealth was nearly over. The 24 aircraft began to spread out into their individual attack headings, each pilot focusing on a specific pier or a specific hull. The silence of the night was about to be shattered by the sound of 40,000 pounds of high explosives. 2:23 in the morning, 10 miles south of the Bandar Abbas Naval Base, the lead FA-18 Super Hornet pulled its nose up, climbing from 300 feet to 4,000 feet in a matter of seconds. The sudden change in altitude was a calculated risk, exposing the aircraft to enemy radar for the first time in 30 minutes. In the rear seat of the lead aircraft, the weapons systems officer stared at the high-definition display of the ATFLIR pod. The advanced targeting, forward-looking infrared sensor was slicing through the thick, humid haze of the Persian Gulf like a thermal knife. The naval base appeared on the screen as a complex grid of white and gray heat signatures. The air over the port was heavy with the smell of diesel exhaust and the stagnant water of the inner harbor. At coordinates 27 degrees, 8 minutes north, 56 degrees, 12 minutes east, the primary targets were finally locked. 3 Kilo-class submarines, their massive black hulls, nearly 300 feet long, were tied to the northern face of Pier 2. Their thermal signatures were unmistakable, and the heat from their internal cooling systems glowed like embers on the display. Just to the east, 4 of the smaller Fateh-class coastal submarines were clustered together. Their 50-meter hulls looked like silver needles under the infrared light. These Fateh-class boats, while smaller, represented a significant threat to United States shipping due to their ability to operate in the shallow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Their destruction was a priority for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the mission planners had assigned 2 aircraft to each hull to ensure total destruction. The weapons systems officer used his thumbstick to slew the laser designator over the first Kilo-class boat. A small green box snapped onto the center of the submarine's sail, indicating a perfect track. Target acquired. Track file is solid. Designating Alpha 1, he said, his voice flat and professional. Across the rest of the strike package, 20 other aviators were performing the same lethal choreography. Each aircraft had been assigned a specific hull or a critical piece of infrastructure, such as the massive gantry crane used for loading heavyweight torpedoes. The Iranian defenses were finally beginning to react. On the pilot's warning receivers, the high-pitched chirp of the short-range radar systems intensified. The base was waking up, but it was too late. The American pilots were already entering their final weapon release parameters. The mission computers on the Super Hornets were now calculating the exact microsecond the bombs needed to leave the racks to account for the aircraft's speed and the wind over the harbor. Each 2,000-pound bomb was equipped with a GPS guidance kit that utilized a set of 4 maneuverable tail fins. These fins would guide the weapon with a circular error of probability of less than 5 meters. The sea below was a dark, oily mirror, reflecting the flickering lights of the shipyard. In the distance, the first streaks of red tracer fire from 30mm anti-aircraft guns began to reach into the sky. They were firing blindly, searching for ghosts that were already on top of them. The humidity of the Gulf night clung to the canopies of the jets, the water droplets streaking backward at 500 knots. The pilots could feel the tension in the air, a physical weight that pressed against them as they prepared for the moment of commitment. 30 seconds to release, the strike lead announced. Every sensor on the FA-18 was now focused on the concrete and steel of the piers. The AN/APG-79 radar was operating in its most precise mapping mode, providing a three-dimensional view of the harbor that allowed the pilots to distinguish between the submarines and the support vessels moored alongside them. The technical superiority of the United States Navy was on full display, as a dozen different systems worked in perfect harmony to ensure that every pound of high explosive would find its intended mark. The strike lead checked his fuel and his distance one last time. He was flying at exactly 520 knots. His wings level, his eyes locked on the digital countdown on his heads-up display. The Iranian submarine fleet was sitting motionless, caught in the crosshairs of a superpower. Everything was in place. The crews in the cockpits held their breath as the countdown hit 5 seconds. The silence in the cockpits was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the aviators into their masks. 2:24 in the morning. The sky over the Bandar Abbas Naval Base. The countdown on the lead pilot's heads-up display reached 0. Lead is Winchester on primary targets, he transmitted, his voice steady despite the high G turn he was about to execute. Across the formation, the same sequence was repeating in perfect, lethal synchronization. The mission computers handled the heavy lifting, but the pilots felt every ounce of the transition as the aircraft's center of gravity shifted instantly. The trigger was squeezed. From the underwing racks of the lead FA-18 Super Hornet, two 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions detached with a heavy, metallic clunk. The aircraft surged upward, suddenly lightened by 2 tons of ordnance. The bombs tumbled for a fraction of a second, before their GPS-guided tail fins snapped open, biting into the humid air. They shrieked toward the harbor, leaving invisible trails of mathematical precision through the night. The heat of the release washed over the wing surfaces, the friction of the descent beginning to warm the steel casings to hundreds of degrees. The first warhead punched straight through the pressure hull of the lead Kilo-class submarine, detonating deep inside the forward battery compartment. The explosion was not a single sound. The pressure hull of the lead Kilo-class submarine, detonating deep inside the forward battery compartment. The explosion was not a single sound, but a series of catastrophic ruptures that tore the steel plating like wet paper. A pillar of white-hot fire and pulverized machinery erupted from the sail, shooting 60 meters into the air. The second bomb slammed into the concrete pier alongside, the shockwave snapping the heavy mooring lines and sending the shattered remains of a fueling crane flying into the harbor. The Kilo-class boat groaned. Its spine snapped as thousands of tons of seawater began to flood the engine room. The Iranian defenders on the pier erupted in a frenzy of desperate motion. Sailors who had been sleeping in the barracks ran toward the burning docks, their faces bleached white by the glare of the fires. A twin 30mm anti-aircraft battery near the harbor entrance began to traverse wildly, its barrels spitting long tongues of orange flame into the darkness. The rounds tore through the smoke but found nothing but empty air as the American jets were already banking hard. Away from the kill zone, on the burning pier, a secondary explosion from a ruptured fuel line sent a wall of liquid fire rolling over the smaller Fateh-class submarines. Black smoke, thick with the stench of burning rubber and heavy fuel oil, blotted out the stars over Bandar Abbas. The harbor was no longer a naval base, but a landscape of twisted metal and rising heat. The sound of secondary internal explosions continued to rumble from beneath the waterline as the first submarines settled into the silt of the harbor floor. The radio channels of the Iranian Port Authority were a chaotic mess of overlapping screams and contradictory orders, while the American strike package regrouped 5 miles to the south. Inside the cockpit of the lead Super Hornet, the weapons systems officer watched the carnage through the ATFLIR pod. The high-definition thermal feed showed the Kilo-class submarine rolling onto its port side, the massive hole in its deck glowing like a dying star. The infrared signature of the base had transformed from a static map of cold steel into a chaotic bloom of white-hot energy. Direct hits on Alpha 1 and Alpha 2, the weapons systems officer reported. Target Alpha 1 is confirmed, neutralized. She's going down by the bow. Pier 2 is heavily damaged and currently engulfed in secondary fires. The pilot banked the aircraft, the G-forces pulling at his face. He could see the fires with his own eyes now, a jagged orange scar on the coastline of Iran. The systematic destruction of the submarine fleet was proceeding exactly according to the plan developed at Pacific Command weeks earlier. There was no room for error, and so far, the American technology had performed flawlessly. To the east, the second wave of Super Hornets was already beginning its run. They were targeting the remaining Kilo-class boat and the cluster of Fateh-class coastal submarines. The Iranian anti-aircraft fire was becoming more organized, with several more batteries joining the fray. Streaks of green and red tracers crisscrossed the sky, creating a lethal web of light. 2. This is lead. Re-engaging for BDA pass, the strike lead commanded. Watch for those man pads on the warehouse roofs. They're starting to wake up. The air was filled with the sound of the jet's screaming engines and the distant, muffled thuds of the anti-aircraft guns. The smell of the ocean was gone, replaced entirely by the acrid stink of high explosives and burning diesel that rose thousands of feet into the air. The first phase of the strike was over, but the most dangerous minutes of the mission, the assessment, and the second hammer blow were just beginning. The United States Navy had delivered its message, and the Iranian Navy was currently paying the price in steel and blood. 2:26 in the morning. The sky over the Bandar Abbas Inner Harbor. The first wave had turned the northern pier into a graveyard of twisted steel, but the mission was only half complete. Four FA-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 87 banked hard toward the southern basin, where the remaining Kilo-class submarine and the cluster of Fateh-class boats were attempting to cast off their lines. The smoke from the first strike was now a thick black curtain, illuminated from below by the orange glow of the burning fuel depots. The air at 6,000 feet was turbulent, filled with the rising heat of the inferno and the acrid, metallic stink of vaporized aluminum. At coordinates 27 degrees, 9 minutes north, 56 degrees, 13 minutes east, the second hammer was ready to fall. The lead pilot of the second wave squeezed the red trigger on his control stick. 2 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions shrieked off the heavy-duty racks, their rocket-assisted separation punching them into the slipstream. The 2,000-pound weapons stabilized instantly. Their internal GPS receivers locked onto the precise coordinates of the hardened submarine shelter. The wind screamed past the bomb casings as they accelerated to near supersonic speeds, the heat of friction beginning to char the gray paint on their noses. The first warhead punched straight through the 3 meters of reinforced concrete roofing the submarine pen, detonating with a delayed fuse deep inside the cavernous interior. The explosion did not just destroy the target, it transformed the shelter into a pressure cooker of lethal energy. The massive steel doors were blown outward, sent flying 50 meters into the harbor by a blast wave that compressed the air until it glowed white. The Kilo-class submarine inside was crushed instantly, its thick steel hull collapsing like an empty soda can under the immense atmospheric pressure. A second later, the 2 Fateh-class boats, moored at the adjacent pier, were shredded by a rain of concrete debris and supersonic shrapnel that turned the water around them into a boiling cauldron of white foam and red fire. The Iranian defenders on the southern shore reacted with a mixture of panic and professional desperation. A Russian-made Tor missile system, hidden behind a warehouse, suddenly energized its tracking radar. Two missiles erupted from their vertical launch tubes, their solid fuel motors creating twin pillars of white smoke that rose into the black sky. The Iranian gunners on the harbor walls began to pour a wall of 20mm fire toward the American formation, the tracers creating a lethal web of light that reflected off the oily surface of the water. Break left. Break left. SAM launch, 5 o'clock, the wingman shouted over the encrypted radio. The lead Super Hornet pilot slammed the throttle forward and pulled the aircraft into a 9G brake turn. The flares erupted from the dispenser in a sequence of blinding magnesium stars, drifting slowly toward the water to confuse the incoming infrared seekers. The first Iranian missile exploded prematurely, its proximity fuse triggered by the heat of the flares. The second missile streaked past the tail of the jet, missing the engine nozzle by less than 10 meters before it self-destructed in a spectacular flash of orange and yellow. The pilot's breathing was heavy and ragged in his mask, his flight suit straining against his legs as he fought to keep the aircraft from stalling in the thin, hot air. The immediate aftermath was a scene of absolute devastation. The southern pier had simply ceased to exist as a functional naval asset. Black smoke, thick with the chemical bite of burning propellant and the smell of roasted electrical insulation, rose in a column that could be seen from 30 miles away. The remaining Fateh-class submarines were either at the bottom of the harbor or were burning so fiercely that their internal torpedoes began to cook off, sending smaller secondary explosions rippling through the water every few seconds. The Iranian submarine fleet, the most significant underwater threat in the region, had been obliterated in less than 10 minutes. The harbor was a landscape of fire and silence, the only sound being the distant roar of the departing American jets and the crackle of the inferno consuming the docks. 2:35 in the morning. The dark, cold airspace, 60 miles off the coast of southeastern Iran, high above the black expanse of the Gulf of Oman, at an altitude of 26,000 feet, the logistical backbone of the strike was waiting. 3 KC-135 Stratotankers and 2 KC-46 Pegasus aircraft from the United States Air Force moved in a giant oval orbit known as a racetrack. They were the lifeblood of the mission, flying gas stations that turned a short-range strike into a sustained strategic blow. The air at this altitude was thin and freezing, the stars above shining with a hard, unwavering light that reflected off the polished aluminum of the massive tankers. Inside the cockpits of the tankers, the crews were working in hushed tones, their faces illuminated by the soft red and amber glow of the instrument panels. They were monitoring the fuel levels in their massive internal tanks, which held over 180,000 pounds of jet fuel. On their radar screens, the blue icons of the strike force were approaching from the north, their fuel states critical after the high-speed maneuvers and heavy afterburner usage over Bandar Abbas. The environment inside the tanker was a contrast of sensory details. The cabin was filled with the steady, bone-deep thrum of the 4 massive turbofan engines, while the air smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint, sweet scent of Jet A fuel. In the rear of the KC-46 Pegasus, the boom operator sat at a digital station, using high-definition cameras to watch the dark sky behind the aircraft. Gas 1. This is strike lead. We are inbound for the basket. With a flight of 4, the radio crackled. The voice was tight, the adrenaline of the combat still present in the pilot's tone. The first flight of FA-18 Super Hornets appeared out of the darkness like sharks rising from the depths. Their navigation lights were extinguished, visible only as faint, ghostly shapes against the stars through the tanker's infrared cameras. Each fighter was down to less than 3,000 pounds of fuel, a state known as bingo, which left them with almost no margin for error. The pilots were exhausted, their bodies aching from the high G turns and the intense focus of the low-level target run. The KC-135 Stratotanker extended its refueling drogues, Two long, flexible hoses with shuttlecock-shaped baskets at the ends. The baskets danced in the turbulent wake of the tanker, a difficult target for a tired pilot to hit at 300 knots. The air between the two aircraft was thick with the smell of unburned hydrocarbons and the sharp ozone scent of high-altitude air. Lead is stabilized. Moving into the basket, the Super Hornet, pilot said. He eased the nose of his jet forward, the refueling probe extending from the right side of the aircraft's nose like a silver lance. With a steady hand, he guided the probe into the center of the basket. There was a mechanical clunk as the nozzle locked into place, and the green lights on the tanker's belly signaled that the flow had begun. For the next 5 minutes, 60,000 pounds of fuel per hour surged through the line, heavy jet fuel moving at high pressure to quench the thirst of the fighter's engines. The weight of the fuel caused the fighter to grow heavier, the pilot having to constantly adjust the throttle to maintain his position in the formation. The coordination of this daisy chain was managed by the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, orbiting 30 miles to the south. The air battle managers inside the Hawkeye were directing each flight of 4 aircraft to a specific tanker, ensuring that no pilot was left waiting until his engines flamed out. It was a masterpiece of military logistics, a synchronized dance of 50-ton tankers and 30-ton fighters performed in total darkness while less than 100 miles from enemy territory. Every gallon of fuel transferred was a testament to the reach of the United States Navy and Air Force. Without these tankers, the strike force would have been forced to ditch in the sea or land at a neutral airfield. Instead, as each Super Hornet disconnected from the basket, its tanks were full, providing desk cake, another 2 hours of flight time, and the ability to fight its way back to the carrier if intercepted. The logistics did not end with fuel. High above the tankers, a satellite link was already transmitting the initial battle damage assessment from the F-35 Bravo sensors back to the Gerald R. Ford. The carrier's intelligence officers were analyzing the imagery in real time, confirming that 40,000 pounds of ordnance had successfully reached their targets. The mission was entering its final phase, and thanks to the silent work of the tanker crews, the strike force was refueled and ready for the long flight home. 2:55 in the morning. The edge of the Iranian air defense identification zone, 80 miles south of the mainland. The strike package was now flying in a wide combat spread, the 24 aircraft of Carrier Air Wing 8, creating a wall of radar signatures that moved steadily toward the safety of the open sea. Even with full fuel tanks from the tankers, the pilots remained on high alert. The Iranian Air Force had finally managed to scramble a flight of 4 Phantom interceptors from an inland airbase, and the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye was currently tracking them as they climbed to 30,000 feet. The air at this altitude was crystalline and silent, but the radio channels were filled with the professional, rapid-fire coordination of the American air battle managers. Strike lead. This is Hawkeye. You have 4 bogies at your 12 o'clock, high, range 60 miles, and closing at 500 knots, the controller's voice stated. Inside the cockpit of the lead FA-18 Super Hornet, the pilot checked his tactical display. The Iranian interceptors were old technology, but they were still armed with radar-guided missiles that could be lethal if they managed to gain a lock. The United States Navy pilots did not want a dogfight. Their mission was accomplished, and the goal now was a clean egress. Copy. Hawkeye. All flights, go active. On jamming. Let's give them something to look at, the strike lead commanded. The 4 EA-18 Golf Growlers, still positioned on the flanks of the formation, energized their ALQ-2-118 tactical jamming receivers. They did not just flood the airwaves with noise this time. They used a technique known as digital radio frequency memory. This allowed the Growlers to capture the incoming .A Iranian radar pulses and retransmit them with a slight delay. On the Iranian radar screens, the single American formation suddenly blossomed into a a cloud of hundreds of ghost targets, appearing and disappearing across the horizon. The Iranian pilots, faced with a radar screen that looked like a shattered mirror, were forced to slow their approach. They could not find a solid lock-on for their missiles. Meanwhile, the 4 F-35 Bravo stealth fighters moved to the front of the American formation. Using their low observable profiles, they slipped toward the Iranian interceptors, their sensors gathering detailed electronic intelligence on the enemy's fire control systems. The F-35 Bravo pilots did not fire. They simply loomed in the darkness, a silent threat that the Iranian pilots could feel but could not see. At latitude 24 degrees, 15 minutes north, the strike package crossed the final line of the Iranian maritime border. The environmental transition was subtle but felt by every pilot. The tension that had sat in their shoulders for the last 2 hours began to ebb, replaced by the grueling fatigue of the mission's end. The air inside the cockpits felt heavy, the scent of the oxygen masks now a familiar, suffocating presence. Below them, the Persian Gulf was a vast, dark void, the only lights being the occasional flickering lanterns of small fishing dhows that had no idea a multi-billion-dollar air war had just passed over their heads. Target clear. Crossing the fence. The strike lead reported. Suddenly, a long-range SA-20 Gargoyle surface-to-air missile battery from the Iranian interior made one final, desperate attempt. A single, high-frequency tracking beam swept across the American formation. On the pilot's warning displays, the threat icon flashed a brilliant, pulsing red. Contact. We have a paint. Brake right. Chaff, chaff, chaff. The lead Super Hornet pilot kicked the rudder and pulled the stick, the aircraft groaning as it bit into a 6G turn. From the rear of the jet, a cloud of chaff, thousands of tiny strips of aluminum-coated glass was ejected into the air. To the Iranian radar, it looked like a massive, stationary target. The missile, if it had been fired, would have been blinded by the decoy. But the Iranian operators, realizing their radar was being jammed from 3 different directions by the Growlers, never launched. The tracking beam flickered and then died as the American jets moved beyond the missile's effective range. The egress was nearly complete. The strike package began its long, gradual descent toward the recovery point in the North Arabian Sea. The pilots turned their attention to the technical details of the landing, checking hydraulic pressures, cycling the landing gear, and reviewing the fuel consumption rates. The coordination of 24 aircraft landing on a single pitching deck in the middle of the night was a mission in itself. On the horizon, the first faint glow of the USS Gerald R began to appear on the infrared sensors. The carrier was running dark, its lights hooded to prevent visual detection by submarines, but to the American pilots, the ship was a beacon. They were returning with every aircraft they had launched, having successfully dismantled the primary naval threat of a regional adversary. The silence of the Gulf night returned, the only sound being the steady, rhythmic drone of 48 jet engines carrying 30 sailors back to their home of steel and salt. 3:15 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea. The USS Gerald R. was a pool of dim, red light in a desert of black water. From 10 miles away, the strike package began its approach for a Case 3 recovery, the most demanding maneuver in naval aviation. The 24 aircraft of Carrier Air Wing 8 were no longer a cohesive fighting unit, but a line of individual pilots, each one fighting exhaustion, salt-crusted visors, and the relentless motion of the ocean. Inside the cockpit of the lead FA-18 Super Hornet, the pilot's world had shrunk to the glowing symbols on his heads-up display. His hands were steady on the controls, but his legs were shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. The air in the cockpit felt stagnant, thick with the smell of his own sweat and the metallic tang of the oxygen system. He could see the meatball, the optical landing system on the carrier's port side flickering through the darkness. 101. 3/4 of a mile. Coupled. The landing signal officer's voice came through the headset, calm and guiding. The pilot adjusted the throttles, the twin engines whining as they fought to maintain the precise glide slope. The carrier's deck was pitching in a 3-meter swell, the stern rising and falling with a slow, heavy rhythm. At 150 miles per hour, the Super Hornet crossed the fantail. The pilot slammed the throttles to full military power. The instant the wheels touched the deck, a standard safety measure in case the tailhook missed the wires, there was a violent, bone-jarring slam as the hardened steel hook caught the number 3 arresting wire. The pilot was thrown forward into his shoulder harnesses, as 60,000 pounds of aircraft was snatched from 150 miles per hour to a dead stop in less than 2 seconds. The physical shock was immense, a crushing weight that forced the air out of his lungs. The wire sang with a high-pitched metallic scream. As it retracted, the yellow-shirted flight deck directors moved in instantly, their wands waving the jet out of the landing area to make room for the next aircraft. One by one, the 24 jets returned. The Growlers, the stealthy F-35 Bravos, and the heavy-hitting Super Hornets all found the deck. In less than 40 minutes, the flight deck was once again a crowded maze of folded wings and cooling engines. Inside the carrier's Carrier Intelligence Center, the mood was one of grim, professional satisfaction. Captain James Miller and his senior staff stood around a massive digital map table. High-resolution infrared imagery from the F-35 Bravo sensors and real-time satellite feeds from the National Reconnaissance Office were being overlaid to create a final battle damage assessment. The results were catastrophic for the Iranian Navy. The imagery confirmed that all 3 Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines had been destroyed. One was resting on the harbor floor in pieces, another was burned to the waterline, and the third was a twisted wreck inside its collapsed concrete shelter. All 4 Fateh-class coastal submarines were confirmed sunk or non-operational. The gantry cranes, the primary torpedo storage facility, and the main refueling pier had been leveled. The Iranian submarine threat in the Strait of Hormuz has been neutralized, the intelligence officer reported, pointing to the smoking ruins on the screen. Estimates suggest it will take them at least a decade to recover even a fraction of this capability. The cost to United States forces was light, but not zero. 2 Super Hornets had returned with minor shrapnel damage from anti-aircraft fire, and 1 pilot was being treated for a minor neck injury, sustained during the high-G egress. However, not a single aircraft or pilot had been lost. The professionalism of the air wing and the overwhelming technical superiority of the Gerald R Ford systems had carried the day. As the sun began to peak over the eastern horizon, casting a pale orange light over the North Arabian Sea, the flight deck crews were already at work. They were washing down the aircraft, refueling the tanks, and preparing for the next launch cycle. There was no victory celebration. The mission was complete, the objective was achieved, and the United States Navy was already looking toward the next horizon. The Iranian submarine fleet was gone, obliterated in a single night of precision and power. The sea remained vast and indifferent, the white wake of the carrier the only mark left on the black water.